Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is episode 3 of our 6-part webinar series. Topic today is going to be project and portfolio and intake process management. As we said, in the earlier sessions, this is a series, so each one of these topics is interrelated. We're going to talk about project and portfolio intake process management, and then next subject is going to be new product development and innovation. When we present the material here, you'll see that the innovation subject is, we talk about the intake process and how you can do it, but in terms of like an innovation engine and an incubation engine, that's all going to be the focus of the next episode. So I hope everybody's able to attend for both of these. Please, if you'd like to get additional people to join us, there's the registration information. It's under quantumpm.com/webinars. I'd also like to share with the team that an invitation to all of you and anybody in your organization. We've got a series of in-person hands-on events we're doing with Project Online and Power BI. Really what that's going to focus on is, walking through the Microsoft toolset, but in the context of, what are the capabilities, what are the enabling technologies that, the type of processes that can be enabled through this technology toolset. So we'll talk about things like some of the things we're talking about today, portfolio management, how we're going to do the intake processing. I mean, those will be covered in these sessions. We could talk about, some of the experiences different groups are having, and also, some of the best practices around it. So we have a session next week in Los Angeles on the 4th, the 17th in Denver, and April 24th in Dallas. And you can sign up on our website for that. It's quantumpm.com/projectonline hands-on event. And you can sign on directly with that, or you can, if you have questions, you can reach out to Lori or myself. Lori is our marketing manager, and she's on as well. For those of you who are new, who we are a Gold Microsoft partner specializing in PPM type solutions. So, standing up PMOs, enabling different type of processes using Microsoft toolset. That's kind of an area of our focus. We try to develop, value creating processes that can support, multitude of different functions across an organization. We also have a tool called BI Advantage, which focuses on systems integration. We call it an integration hub, which really allows you to integrate multiple applications with Project Online or Power BI or Azure through Azure to really get you an enterprise-wide technology solution. So, we're definitely a Microsoft partner. We're definitely leading the way when it comes to purposes of integration across applications. Okay, let's talk about this. The one today is about project portfolio and intake process managers. And really there's a couple of key focuses here. Portfolio management, and this definition came from the Association of Project Management. It's from the UK. The goal is to balance changing initiatives, business as usual, while optimizing return on investment. A lot of the definitions we use for portfolio management really come from financial industry, as a matter of fact, in terms of the management of a portfolio of financial products. So it's really, managing and ensuring that the projects that you're expending scarce resources on are the most value deriving and most value driving group of processes that we have, group of projects that you might have. And this can be alignment with strategy, could be alignment with your business strategy, organizational strategy, and also rationalization. Intake process and ideation. These are really focusing on how do we use the strength of a company to develop ideas. And one of the things you'll see in a couple slides is, kind of some best practices around how this would work. But it's really around taking the strengths and capabilities of the company and encouraging a culture of creativity and innovation, and then using it and the whole intake process is around, scoring concepts and seeing how, what the value we think is associated with these concepts, and then take them all the way from idea phase all the way to an actual project. So we're going to demonstrate how some of this can be done, but also, talk about best practices around portfolio and project management. Portfolio management intake processing. This is a I did quite a bit of research here about best practices around portfolio management. And there's an excellent article in McKinsey Quarterly from October 2017 that really encapsulates a lot of the best practices that can be utilized. It's interesting because a lot of the same concepts that can apply to capital markets or financial services can also apply here to, in more general, in the portfolio management space. I think the first one is, make it a priority, capital portfolio a priority, whether a project portfolio management a priority. Have a portfolio management strategy to build the winning strategies. And here's the other one: link strategic imperative to the investment portfolio. So basically, what you're trying to do here is making sure that there is alignment between what the portfolio is being scored on or evaluated on, and making sure that's aligned with the strategic imperatives of a particular business. And that's something we do a lot of with clients, is really, making them understand what I call, value levers. How do they define value? And having these things well defined that can be applied consistently and uniformly across the organization. The other one is tapping an organization's collective wisdom. I mean, that's one of a lot of really innovative companies do, is they're, not just thinking about it from one segment or one component of a company. In a lot of cases, talk about engineering, operations, procurement to bring the best thinking to the surface and help introduce some more commercial inputs so that the portfolio is best and can be best for the business. So really what you're trying to do here is ensure that, many different stakeholders and fiefdoms within an organization have an opportunity to contribute to the projects that can potentially be candidates for their portfolio. And this is where, and I have clients of mine who, do quite a bit of this, is where the whole intake process is useful, where there's incentives to come up with ideas and then score them as we go along. And then the other thing is make sure that basically cross-pollinate best practices across the different solutions, is really making sure you've got collaboration systems in place that can be used to capture that. You don't want to just have, ad hoc, somebody hands you a piece of paper. You want something that is, definable and actually has a uniform process and methodology for scoring and evaluating these. This is another one, is in terms of the objectives here. It's really making sure we want to have there are clear objectives associated with the portfolio, and we have the opportunity to compare seemingly different types of projects. I mean, one of the challenges people have is that they think, this is not the same kind of project, a different type of activity, and really you want to make sure that you have a mechanism for what we call apples to apples basis comparison across disparate categories. I mean, here's a good example here where, chemical company forced a management discussion to compare the quantitative facts with qualitative rankings of its portfolio. It led to informed trade-offs in productivity, growth, and maintenance of categories, increasing the portfolio net present value by over 30%. And I think that's pretty important. I mean, a lot of times what you find is when you're doing a portfolio analysis, ensuring that everything is included in the portfolio and they are scored consistently. And in some cases, even if it's, you might think they don't necessarily can all fit under the same methodology, it's important to make sure that you try to do so, just so that you can have an apples and apples comparison and have a numeric scoring. Because a lot of times what happens is, you find the thumb on the scale effect, and this is an opportunity to fight back against that. This is a good one. Number 4, scrub the business case for each project multiple times throughout the project lifecycle. You need to have a business case for inclusion into the portfolio. But one of the things you need to think about is to validate and revisit the business case as the project is in flight, because a lot of times you might find that the rationale for a project is no longer valid, and the right answer here would be to discontinue work on that. I mean, I have a client of mine who, famously told us that they don't believe in sunk costs. If you've got a project that even though you invested money in, if it's never going to be viable in the future, stop digging. And I think that's an important lesson here as well. So it's really, this is another example from the McKinsey study. It's something like, 10 to 30% reduction in spending for non-major projects can be achieved. So, what that can also be thought of is that that's additional funding that's available for innovative projects, for things that can be used that, can be higher risk projects with a higher return. But this money can be used for funding innovation or other more strategic type projects. So organizationally, what I try to tell people to do is, have a portfolio review process, which includes both candidates and and in-flight projects, minimum quarterly, ideally a monthly type activity, and have the technology in place to provide uniform scoring. Okay, this is another one, is the ROI on these projects. Make sure that you're tracking the ROI across, because, a lot of times, you need to have a way of uniformly scoring these things so you can understand, what the return would be. So having a uniform definition of what an ROI is good. And this is a good point here about the whole standard metrics and calculations. Ensuring that you understand the key data points that are required for scoring of the specific project, and building that into the technology solution. Those are all very critical to ensure that, that you've got, as they say, an apples to apples comparison for the different projects. Okay, here's some other excellence in portfolio management. Streamline approvals to make contextually informed decisions. You don't want to have a situation where, where things are so cumbersome and so tight that you really can't move things along. You want to make sure that the approvals are, are narrowly defined. They've got basically, usually a lot of times you've got a product development quality gating type concept in place that can be used to apply uniform standards for how a particular project should be approved. This is another one that's useful here, is this: forecast more frequently enable tactical shifts. So a lot of times, you want to make sure that, and that's what these technology tools can do, is that, you want to shorten the cycles for portfolio reviews and portfolio management and activities to enable tactical shifts. And a good example there is, if we look at our portfolio quarterly or every 6 months, you can easily find yourself in a situation where you've got projects that are in flight because, there's so much momentum built behind them that, you're not, that it actually could have been no longer relevant or no longer strategic. You want to make sure that, you've got the actual data. The actual data flows automatically into the capital management system, so the project managers can easily and frequently update forecasts and have these be automatic as much as possible. As they say, is, if you've got real-time data and near-term data, it gives you the opportunity to be more responsive and less reactive, so you can proactively manage opportunities and risks that may emerge going forward. This one's also good, unified cross-platform approach. I mean, one of the challenges you see in a lot of organizations is the silos. I've dealt with this in, technology companies, healthcare companies, a lot of companies that have grown through M&A type activities where, you've got these silo organizations. They haven't necessarily been cross-pollinated or have, integrated in such a way that we apply uniform standards for evaluating projects. This is usually a big challenge because, a lot of times these silos are aligned with their own unique P&L statements. So you've got a stakeholder who's in charge of it who has, in effect, his own money, which I think, is useful, but it's one of the challenges that companies need to focus on. But if you're thinking enterprise-wide, you need to ensure that, you're trying to bring everybody into the investment life cycle so that the portfolio review process is looking at everything that's being worked on. So this allows you to, optimize the deployment of things like resources and capital to maximize the ROI on an investment portfolio. And the last one I think is absolutely important, and this is true for all of PPM and all of type of organizational change management type activities, is the whole concept of continuous improvement. One of the things good organizations do, and this is we can talk about this throughout the project management lifecycle, is we can take the outputs of our learning, apply them to our ROIs, apply them to our metrics, to our scoring. But it's incumbent upon us to go back and look and say, are there things we could have done better or differently, or if we've got uniform, or else if we've got consistent problem statements that we need to address to really see if there's anything we can do to improve things. One of the things I always advise people to do is reporting. Power BI is very good at identifying and doing analysis on like product development or any type of process, and look back and see if there's systemic trends where things are continuously late, things are continuously bottlenecking, understanding why. For example, if we've got projects with in this case, an ROI that we've guaranteed, and then all of a sudden, the actuals wind up being a lot different than we expected, is really to go back and look at the process and see if there's a way we can scrub it and more fine tune it. And this can also be done for like estimations and things. It's really an across the board thing. So a lot of times this can be a key function for like a PMO type organization to support this whole culture of continuous improvement. So these are the 9 best practices for portfolio management. You can see how it integrates quite well with ideation and intake process. Are there any questions so far?
No questions, Steve. Steve, I'm sorry. John?
Okay, so let's talk about some other things here. We've got quite a bit of best practice type stuff before we get to our demo section. This is a pretty representative flow of what ideation looks like. And this is a pretty standard thing. I mean, a lot of times what you've got here is you'd have a pipeline, and companies really need to have some type of a construct to do this where, how do we get all the way from just a general thought, like one piece of paper, all the way through, discovery, which could be the second part of it where you're bringing in different stakeholder groups. And then you have a more formal scoping. And it's important when you hit these gates along the bottom here that there's a mechanism for, further refining the actual ROI, but also the investment decision that's required, the investment that's required for a specific proposal project. And what you find is when they actually become, develop, test, and launch, you'll see that the investment from the company's perspective, increases as you progress along here. So it's important to really understand, how we're measuring projects from point to point to point as we go along. But this whole idea of an ideation funnel is pretty good, and we'll talk about, incubation engines and concepts for innovation hubs and things of that sort in the next session we're going to do, which is episode 4. But most of the clients I've dealt with, a lot of this is, a lot of in the case of new product development or R&D, I've seen a lot of that before. Really what they have is they've got a methodology that encompasses all of this entire flow here. And they've got quality gates that they use with approvers that stack up vertically along these particular gates that are used to progress things along. And then what they do is they're increasing the level of accuracy of the ROI and the investment decision. So, by the time you hit the first gate, it might be plus or minus 50%. For cost and ROI, but then by the time you get to the second, they're asking for plus or minus 20%. Even when we go into actual development of the proof of concept of the product, they'll ask for increased levels of specificity as we progress down the individual flow. Okay, so this is what we call what a PMO structure could look like. A lot of times you've got demand coming from lines of business. You got supply coming from different capabilities within the organization. The goal here within a company is, supply equals demand, and that's what portfolio management does. Is we want to make sure that the resources we're providing, the supply we're providing, is being deployed to drive the optimum amount of value we can deliver to the consumers of the product. So we want to get supply equal to demand in such a way that the value being delivered from that equation is maximized to the extent possible. And what we focus on here from a portfolio management and intake process is really this whole piece here where, like we talked about, making sure we've got criteria for investment decisions, scoring of ROIs and things of that sort between what we call the providers of the demand, which can be the lines of business, it could be the overall strategy, and our ability to provide the functionality. One of the key roles you're going to see in a lot of organizations is what they call a business relationship manager, or BRM, which really acts as the liaison, shall we say, between the expectations of the business and whoever's providing the supply. In a typical IT model, you'd have somebody who works with the strategic lines of business or the face of the customer, understanding what their proposals are, and then in terms of scoring and evaluating these things so that we can get consensus and agreement between these two groups, the BRM would be the person negotiating that, and that's more of a business / strategic type person who can provide a technology insights into what the business is asking for. And this is also important from an overall planning perspective because, depending upon what the demand is from the lines of business, that can impact what we need to do from a supply side. Do we need to bring more vendors in? Do we need more contractors? Do we need additional, third parties? Do we need to use managed service providers? So we can influence the structure of our of our supply operation based upon what the demand looks like and what the ROI is. So if I have a a high level investment, I want to make sure that, gee, if I could make the business case, I actually figure out a way of expanding our overall supply. So here talks about the focus of what the business relationship manager would focus on. Basically strategic alignment. It's really making sure that we've got an alignment between the business strategy and the technology strategy. Demand management, where we're focusing on translating business needs into IT actions, and then delivery oversight, which is really ensuring that the technology capability, and this is in this case is IT, but this can be true of any other product we're bringing to bear, making sure that we're actually delivering the value that we promised. Some of the other views here can be around management reporting, ensuring that we've got timely information flowing to the stakeholders so that they can, manage expectations about when things will be delivered. Business partnership, ensuring that we've got alignment between business partners, and then the IT partnership, or in this case, if it's, working with the supply side of the equation that says, we've got partnered with the supply side, this is the demand side. So making sure that both of these two different stakeholders are managed. And here's some of the, sample responsibilities that you might have, but really it's focused on, making sure that we're aligned with strategy, making sure the demand and what we're working on is aligned with the strategy and the expectations of the customer, making sure we can guarantee delivery, or we can ensure that, that the business understands when things will be delivered so that they can manage their interaction with customers. So it's really, the handshake type role is a way to describe it. Some of the other activities that the groups that the business or the BRM would be dealing with, would be, business planning, understanding what the business expectations are, what the planning is from the business side. Manage the work intake, which is really like I was saying, the handshake role between, what's coming into the portfolio and, what the supply can actually deliver. Working with the delivery teams, really to make sure we've got a commitment between the business stakeholders and the IT commitment. This is an important one, risk management. Should we have deficiencies or problems coming up from a risk management perspective, ensuring that we have mechanisms for addressing these and mitigating them as much as possible. Responsible for project delivery, where, ensuring that we have that stakeholder who can say, okay, the delivery is going to happen on a certain day so that the business can count on that capability for driving for delivering product to the customer. And then the budget tracking, where we need to manage things like, financial status, results, monitoring, metrics, really and the SLAs and metrics and SLAs, which is really about, ensuring that financially we're not just delivering the solution that we described or promised to the business teams, but also have the financial return on investment that's required, and the financial investment that's required, so that we're not really, overrunning budgets, and the expectations in terms of what this is going to cost is actually being managed and maintained. Okay. Any other questions on the BRM role? Because that's a pretty important role, because if you don't have something like that, organizationally what you're going to have is a misalignment between demand and supply, and it causes huge problems, because what the result is, and I see this all the time with clients, is the business is not happy with in many cases IT or whoever's providing the service. They think they're under delivering, and from a perception perspective, having that relationship is important to manage expectations with the business community. So do we have any questions on that?
Not yet, but we might be having one come in a minute. So I'll let you know, John. Right now, no.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty important, because if you don't have that role and the balance between supply and demand, you're going to have unhappy customers, and IT is going to get beaten up. And I see time after time after time this is what happens here, because there's just a misalignment between what the business wants and what they can deliver, and it's not aligned based on strategic priorities. Okay, let's talk about the portfolio process. These are just some some estimates in terms of how these things will be done. Really the way to think of it is just an intake process. Then we do an estimate where the business and the IT managers discuss the request. They do a rough order of magnitude estimate. This could be like a BRM type activity, the business relationship manager doing that. If it's coming from a business stakeholder, if we're doing ideation, this could be something that would be built into the overall process flow. Approval of it. One of the challenges companies have to decide on is what level of approval they want to have for a particular project coming into a portfolio, we frequently see 1, 2, or 3 tier approval processes if we're doing an ideation type model, where you'd have like somebody who would approve it through gate 1, where it would go from just the one sheet of paper type concept to something that will get some level of high level analysis, and then there'll be a second approval required before we would actually create a project that would introduce it into the portfolio. Or it can be a single one. It depends on where the demand is coming from. If it's coming from our ideation engine, or if it's coming from a BRM type model where we're working with the strategic leaders and it's a strategic project. Prioritize the project from a funding start dates perspective. This is something that the steering committee would do, but I like to think of this as the portfolio management team that would do this. And this is where having tools in place that allow you to dynamically score these projects from the value delivered, that will really help the priority. So if I have a very high ROI on something and it's very strategic, that would be something that I would make as a higher priority than some of the ones that aren't. So this is where we have the whole getting the balance between optimizing our cost allocation and the amount of investment money we've got to spend, and resources is another input. Do we have sufficient resources, and making sure they're aligned with the highest value priority of the project? And then you've got the whole execution phase where you bring it into the actual flow. You can actually do this with, this SDLC, this is the standard, like waterfall-based approach. We can introduce this and use agile methods for developing these. For example, in some cases, we did one where we're developing a toy, for example, is one of the examples we've done, where the toy development go through a series of iterative prototypes using agile. If you're doing IT and you're doing like web development or something, that could be an agile-based function. And many organizations are, talking more and more agile as we progress. But that's how the execution would work. One of the challenges defining in terms of the portfolio management approach is, we need to understand, how do we do this, and really what it is defining the model first, which is understanding what the value drivers are, identification of the metrics that we have. For adoption of a portfolio management approach, it's really around defining the model and what the key metrics are for value purposes, identifying the key metrics that we have that could be used and aligned for scoring these, have processes and tools that will support the automation of the valuation of the products, build reports. A lot of times reporting through intake processing is pretty critical, and then continuous improvement. It's really incumbent upon us to go back and see what we did, see if there's if there's deviations between actual and expected, and understand what the driver is there. And here's some examples here for project categories. Strategic business requirements, regulatory, enhancement. It's an executive mandate. I mean, these are ones where, for example, if it's a regulatory requirement, there's not a lot of decision to be made whether we want to do it. But if there's something where it's strategic, for example, or if there's an investment that's associated with, an introduction of like a new line of business, new product, that would involve that could be something that we actually have a decision to make about it. So that would be something we'd want to actually score and figure out, because there's only so much money available for those types of, decidable projects, these projects that we have. And here's some, sample value categories, sample ways of scoring the specific products that we have. So we could have we do it by ROI, TCO, is it a cost avoidance? Is there cost savings, regulatory, business value, and things of that sort? So this is how, if we were to adopt a portfolio management scoring approach, this is kind of how that would be done. And I have this is a good example here of how this would work. One of the things they do is a lot of companies, they have what they call project prioritization matrices. This is usually the high level view of it. So if we're trying to figure out where this thing fits, where it plots at the beginning of it, and this is before we get to the quantitative stage. So if we're early in the flow, we might say to ourselves, okay, what's the business impact and what's the ease of execution? So something that has a high, it's pretty easy to do and has a high business impact, that's usually the ones we want to do. That's the ones that must-haves, right? The ones that are of highest interest are the ones where we've got a high degree of, this is the very easy to execute, high degree of business value. So guess what? That's what we're definitely going to do. Those are the quick wins. If we've got ones here that have high business impact, but there's complexity associated with it, those are the ones we're going to spend a lot of time looking at. You have the ones which are very hard to execute and have low business impact. Those are the money pits, And then you got ones that are like low hanging fruit, where they're just like, again, easy to execute, low business impact, But these are, what we would consider a second choice. And a lot of times what we do is, if we're deciding and developing criteria for adoption of scoring of a portfolio, just having one of these project portfolio matrix on the front end, before you actually get to an ROI is usually an effective way of doing that. And what you can do is align these with what, how do we define business impact? How do we define execution? I mean, like we talked about earlier, there are certain industries that are, because of digital adoption and transformation, are very much in need to move this quickly and have quick cycles here. So this could be a way of actually speeding things through the intake process. Okay. Any questions at this point?
No questions.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of like designing an intake form, and this is usually the way this is done is there's a exercise that occurs as we step through the intake process. And really what you need to do here is, we need to figure out what the key data values are for a project to be considered for inclusion in the portfolio. And really when we talk about business case details, this is really the drivers that will make the decision of, how do we go ahead and do this, and getting consensus and agreement on what these things are is pretty important. And this is also one that, they talk about continuous improvement. I mean, you can refine these specific numbers as these metrics and elements as you progress. So you might find this one should drop out and something else should go in. So this is something that, we take a point and stab at the beginning of the adoption phase. We might fine tune it as we go. But this is definitely the what's called the map, so to speak, of how we would go ahead and do this. And it's really important for a PMO to have a clear understanding of how this would work. And these are facilitated workshops, and you get in front of a whiteboard and getting consensus and getting everyone to nod their heads, not just what are the elements for business case, but also what is a high, what's a low, what's a medium, what are the ranges that differentiate those things. It takes a hard time to do that because you've got in many cases, we talked about cross silos and getting consensus across silos, but getting this and then building this into the tool that you'd use to support that. That's the key activity that would happen at the beginning of an overall process. Portfolio management flow. This is, how do we go from portfolio management to program down to project? The portfolio management side is where we, set the direction in terms of, the strategic planning side of the portfolio. Well, this is really focused on, getting and understanding what projects are included in the portfolio. We get to the program. This is more focused on the execution side of executing the overall program. We've got the details, the gates, the deployment, the closures, you get change control that's associated with it. And then you got the project management where you've got project plans, resources, budget, accountability, project tracking. So the way to think of it is there's three layers of the portfolio management flow where you've got the high level strategic side of it, where this is really, we talked about business relationship managers and intake processing and ROIs and business cases, and all that would be managed up at this level. The program managers would be more focused on the execution, gating, change control, and really management of scope and deployment of the overall program. And then you got project managers responsible for individual projects. So, when we build a PMO out, we need to consider all three of those views, and the organization needs to support all three of those layers of capability. Okay, let's do the demo now. Do you have any questions at this point? Lori, are we good?
We're good, John.
Okay. So, this is this is Microsoft Project Online. One of the things let's talk about intake first. One of the things we can do and support ideation, and we're going to get over that, is really using SharePoint and some workflow capabilities to support creation of ideas and concepts within an organization. And what you can do is, depending upon how you configure it, you can say, okay, project ideas, and you can, in this case, by technology, but you can, not segment them as much as possible, but you can use this as an opportunity to, gather and capture ideas from the group as a stakeholder, from the group as a whole. So in this case, I've got project ideas for technology. And I've got one, if I want to create an idea, I can go in here and go new. And this is just, a simple form. These are all configurable. So when we talked about elements of a business case earlier on, in terms of best practices, we have the capability to streamline or make these forms more specific to whatever the value drivers are that you've defined. So let's see, ideation. So in our example here, I've created one. You can add the description of what the document is, who the submitter is. Put myself in there, for example. If I can define who the project owner is, and these can all be defaulted fields, and I'll show how that can be done as well later on. We can do the benefits case. So if we've got a cost that says, okay, this is going to be $5,000, and the benefits associated with it would be $10,000. We can do a priority, risk indication. And here's the other one. This in our test system here. This is a excuse me. This is a two-tier approval. So we create the idea, then one person approves it, and then it can be moved forward into a project. But you can actually set them up with multiple tiers. I mean, we're doing projects right now where we're setting up 3-4 tier type approval processes. And then you go ahead and you can actually save the overall idea within the flow. So I did one of these earlier just to make sure we had something staged from a timing perspective. But what it does here is it can kick off and trigger. So if you've got so I've got one ideation test 4. I did one earlier here. So if I have a project that's in the portfolio, I can go ahead and say, let's open it up, edit it. So I can approve these things, save them. So what happens here is I've got the idea that went through. I was nominated as the approver. It can trigger a email that's sent to you that says, oh, by the way, there's a project that you have to approve. So now that I've got this here and I've done the one ideation test, I have the option here of, after it's been gone ahead and tested it. I mean, once it's actually been, at that point, it would trigger an email that would go through. You'd come back. It would have to be approved. All this can be controlled by security, so not everybody has the opportunity for making these adjustments. But then I can go ahead and say, okay, after the idea has been approved, create a project from it directly. So what you'd have here is we have an idea that was created in SharePoint. It's gone through an approval. It comes through, and then we want to create a project associated with it. Now, this is pretty important here because what this does is it allows you, based on the fields that are configured for the specific idea, to default specific values that would be associated with it. So, for example, if I want to have budget authorities, I can have budget, this is the total cost, this total benefits. I can have different elements in different fields in here that are configurable and defaulted. So a lot of times if you've got types of ideas, in this case, there might be default values associated with it. But then the other thing you can do is there's an enterprise project type associated with it. Like an enterprise project type is really the default schedule that's associated with a particular type of idea. So if I had an idea that would be like new product development idea, I'd have an enterprise project type called new product development, which would capture that. So these would be associated with it. So I would go through here, and depending upon what the solution is, I can create the project directly from this. And what this does at that point, once the project has been created, it'll reappear in Project Online, so you can actually manage it like a regular project. So this would be an example of something that has gone through the intake process. It's been approved for inclusion into the portfolio, and then once it's included in the portfolio, it says one project has been created. So now we've got this project that's been added to the portfolio. Then we have to look at it from the perspective of portfolio analysis. Yeah, and so this whole ideation engine, I mean, the one I just showed you is a one-tier approval, triggered a workflow here. It should have kicked me an email. I just want to make sure it did. Oop. Not sure why it didn't, but it should have. So this is actually goes ahead and creates the project. So if I go in here and go back to projects in Project Online, this is the one I just created, called Webinar 3 Ideation Test. So I've actually got a project that's included by project type because I'm using the Project Center view that would be considered portfolio by project type. So when you in Project Center in the highest level of the project align tool, you can select the view that would allow you to segment it. Since I use the IT waterfall type project type, this is where it appears. This is the one I just did. So if I go ahead and create the project, look at what was created. What you'll see here is that you have basic information, and this flowed from the idea. So, for example, here's the project health, here's the risk rating. These were things that we entered during the ideation phase that can flow through into the project into what they call project detail pages. So these here are project detail pages that are configurable and aligned to a specific project type. The specific numbers and types of project detail pages associated with the project type, all that's configurable. But the thing that's cool is the data flows from, all the way from an ideation phase into the actual project itself. So should you have documentation, should you have a business case, all that stuff can flow into the project. So what you're going to see here is the type of data that's created for a specific project. You have the project details, project information, the schedule itself. So this would be the actual schedule associated with the project. So you'd have, like, for example, for this project type, this is the default schedule. And what it would have is it would have the key tasks. It would have standard durations, or will be, best practice durations, resource categories that can be assigned with it. And this is all the focus on the continuous improvement theme. I mean, the durations for these tasks, you have an opportunity of fine-tuning this as you progress and gain more experience with the tool. So this is something this is when we talk about the continuous improvement focus of the organization, making sure that these are the correct durations. You might find that there's delays in some of these things, and you might want to go back and fix it. And then you have a SharePoint project site associated with the particular project. So if you wanted to allocate documents to a particular project, you have the capability of doing that. But this is the one that's really cool, is this whole thing about strategic impact. I mean, we talked earlier about finding, levers and mechanisms for evaluating projects. So every one of these projects that comes in, if you determine to assign a strategic impact, so you can do a project type that doesn't have a strategic impact calculus. I mean, I've had plenty of clients where they just come in and they just say, okay, we're doing an infrastructure upgrade. We don't have a choice as to whether or not we're going to do it. So it really doesn't need a strategic impact from a scoring perspective. However, the resource and the cost associated with the project is included in the enterprise-wide calculation. So we can capture it from a cost and resourcing perspective, but from an impact perspective, we really don't. So this gets back to the slide I was showing before, is really, what are the value drivers? Let me go back here for a sec. This kind of thing. What are the value drivers associated with a project for inclusion in the portfolio? And in this case, the tool can capture, can capture these value drivers along with the scoring ranges associated with it. So this is something that, a lot of times companies, when they adopt that, it's a hard thing to get consensus on. It's definitely worthwhile because it gives you a consistent view of it. But this is, how the projects are scored individually when they're actually created. So the next part is okay, how do we do the whole portfolio management function? If you go down to strategy, what you're going to find here, this is how, Project Online can do portfolio analysis. You look at the driver library here. And what this does, this is the enterprise view of what's in the project portfolio. What this is, these are the individual drivers that we have. So those are the ones, the value levers that we talked about. So we'd say, okay, these are the ones that we possibly have. Either some could be active, some could be inactive. We would go ahead and configure, not just what the driver is, but also, what the description of the driver is, whether it's active, and then what the ranges are. What is a moderate? What's a strong? What's an extreme? These are the mechanism for scoring the project impact. And we would define these like during those sessions we had earlier. And the other thing we want to talk about, this whole portfolio analysis and also intake process. This can all be aligned with specific licensing. There's 3 types of licenses for Microsoft. You got the Project Essentials, Project Pro, and then Project Premium. And portfolio analysis is a Project Premium capability. Next part of the portfolio analysis, the whole driver prioritization piece of this, which allows you to have different schemas for weighting the value levers. So the way to think of it is, just because I've got 6 different attributes in which I'm scoring candidate projects, they don't all have to have the same weight. So what you can do here, and what this allows you to do, is to really, to support nonlinear type solutions. It says, okay, we're going to assign different weighting to each one of these. So what you do is you allocate 100%. And what you do is say, okay, well, based on these 6 criteria that I have, or how many of this is 8, I guess it's 7 criteria, how much value does each one get relative to the other one? So we're saying increasing the market share, that gets a 33.67% allocation versus, employee satisfaction, 3.45. So we're basically definitely heavily skewing this one to be a much more important driver than these are. So this is another decision. We'd have to figure out what the drivers are, and then also figure out how we want to relatively weight them. And there could be, as we said earlier, there can be different schemas here depending upon how we're looking at the portfolio, because you can segment your portfolio. One of the great things about this tool is, I can look at from an operations perspective. I can have, do M&A, I can do R&D, I can do IT, I can do lots of different processes, so you can have different stakeholders with different scoring schemas. And then the way we would go ahead and prioritize these is that the system has a function called portfolio analysis, which allows you to develop models that can be used for evaluating both candidate and in-flight process. Remember, we talked about ensuring that we're looking at the business case and revalidating the business case over time. You want to make sure you have a standard model that you use consistently all the time. I've got one here called 2015 to 2018 portfolio analysis. So this allows me to validate and confirm my ROI, like we talked about from a best practices perspective. So in this case, what this does is this is the model I've got. Here's the description of it. Here's the driver prioritization. Remember, we talked about the CIO and the COO. This is executive consensus. How many projects are we selecting? We're just going to use a dozen for purposes of the demo today. But this is really what the description is of the specific model. And then what you can do here is it allows you to look at the projects based on the value levers that we talked about and the relative weighting of the value levers, and to aggregate these. So this gives you some cool stuff. I mean, for these projects, what this says is, okay, this is a heat map showing the alignment between the projects and the individual value levers, whether it's moderate, low, strong. So this can really help you out here in terms of saying, okay, based on this particular one, if I have a specific interest in one lever, what is the alignment from a heat perspective? So it's a good visual tool for looking at the overall value of these. Another capability here is the whole review priority situation, where it says, okay, if we look at the scoring of the overall projects and the weighting that we're assigning to the overall levers, and then pulling them together, how are these? What is the aggregated score, quantitative score for these different projects? And this is key here. So what this does is says, okay, if I want to deliver 100% of strategic value based on all the levers that we have, based on the relative weighting, what is the aggregated score? And this is the numeric number. This is how you push back against people who, the thumb on the scale effect, as I call it, where you could say, look, based on the data points that we have, this is the value that's being delivered for these, and this is why you should do this particular project. And then the way we do the what-if analysis is basically two layers for that. There's the analyze cost and analyze resources view of this. If I'm doing analyze cost, what it says is, okay, from a pure cost perspective, of all the projects I'm considering, what is the best and optimal projects to select for inclusion in the portfolio from a pure cost perspective? These are kind of standalone. It looks at it from a cost perspective, resource perspective, and there's an art side of this where you have to pull these two together really to figure out what the final view is. But what the baseline scenario is, it says I pull everything in, I deliver 100% of my strategic value, and then it says, okay, what is it going to cost? It's going to cost me $8.99 million in this case. Now, the problem, of course, is when you go up to your CFO and the CFO says, well, I'm only going to give you $7 million. Which one should I do and which ones shouldn't I do? And this is where you can build models out here to draw this comparison here to show you which ones should be in and which ones should be out based upon based upon the lever. So, and again, since these are nonlinear, there's going to be a heavy emphasis on the ones with the new market share alignment. So if we have $7 million to spend, we can get 87% of our strategic value. Here are the ones we should include. Here are the ones that should be moved out. And there's also a really cool little compare report here that you can use to, it'll give you an aggregate of what the if we look at all the different scenarios that we've got, it gives you a nice one-sheet definition that says, okay, based on these scenarios, these are the ones that are selected. Here's the heat map that we should have. Here's the total cost. Here's the strategic value that's delivered for a certain amount of dollars. So this is a nice little report that can be used to, provide you that overall view. This is how we look at it from the purposes, and I know we've got 1151, and then so we've got analyze resource here, which does the same sort of analysis from a resourcing perspective, where it says, okay, based on what we've got from a resourcing perspective, which projects should we include? Baseline basically assumes that, assuming our current resource configuration, which projects can we do? And then what this shows you is that we are really short people. So what we've got here is we've got all these different, these are the ones we should select based upon our scarce resources. These are the ones that are excluding. So what this shows me is that I've got a significant misalignment between cost, between the value that can be delivered here and what I can do from a resourcing perspective. What I would do if I'm the portfolio manager, resource manager, is I'd be saying, what can I look at from a vendor management perspective to bring us additional resources into bear to scale this thing up. And the thing that this does, which is really cool, is that you can do different scenarios like hire 4 FTEs by skill sets. What's the impact on projects I can complete. It can also provide you what I call requirements details here, which gives you a time scale view of where we have deficiencies. So, for example, if I am, if I've got projects that are excluded for a particular period of time, it shows me what skills are causing the problem. So, for example, this currency translator, my SME is what's causing me the difficulty there. For this one here, I've got deficiencies for testers and SMEs. For tax checker, look, I've got problems with testers and SMEs again. So what this does is it really gives, from an enterprise perspective, some insights as to, and this you see quite a bit, where there's 1 or 2 skill sets which are causing all the problems in terms of your ability to manage the overall portfolio and bring work in. So I would work with the resource manager and HR and say, look, we got to do some more in terms of testers and SMEs so we can include more into the portfolio. So, this is, pretty powerful and best practice driven. So all the stuff we talked about for best practice we can do with this tool set. And then, of course, the Power BI sits on top of this, which is, upper right quadrant in the Gartner Magic Quadrant. And you can do a lot of stuff in terms of monitoring your overall flow. So, what you've got within Power BI is this concept of dashboards and reports. Reports come from a single source of data. Dashboards are built from a multitude of different reports, so you can build these to the specific and tailor them to the audience. There's a series, what they call content packs, which are the standard Microsoft delivered content for a project online. So we've got a standard dashboard that Microsoft provides, which can be used to, in terms of portfolio dashboard, looks at the overall portfolio health. Here's the software, and here we are by types, where the breakout is. Where we are in terms of phasing. So if we've got a governance piece and associated with different gating, we can look at this from an owner's start end date, what the health looks like. So it gives you the high level view of what's going on. And then you can just go into these individually and say, okay, let's do a deep dive here and figure out what the problem is with one specific one. It can give you views on portfolio. Here's the start date. Here's where we are in terms of completion of these. And all this is, with Power BI, anything is pretty much the sky's the limit in terms of what you can do. Where we are from a health perspective, from a cost perspective, risks, issues, resourcing. When we talk about resourcing, we haven't got to that one yet, but we can see who is over allocated, who's under allocated, who's got available time. So we can pretty much support anything. And the thing that's also cool is this is just the standard Microsoft one, is you can associate this with Teams, so you can easily define your own projects that are out there. So we've got ones that Quantum has developed. Here's ones that we've got project intake ones. So if I have an intake pipeline, like we talked about for ideation, I can look at, what are the benefits and what are the budget costs? Because remember when we did these, we had to input the benefits and the estimated cost, and we can look at the overall portfolio and say, okay, based on the stuff that's out there, let's take an overall look at the portfolio and see if we've got some good opportunities that we might want to deep dive into. So this is also a very useful tool for managing that intake process. So not just what's improved. If I'm the approver, I want to take a look at this and say, okay, what's out there? And if I see something that has a high degree of benefit to the organization, low degree of complexity, which is you can align back to best practices like we talked about here, in terms of prioritization matrix, what's the business impact, what's the execution. So if it's pretty easy to execute, high degree of business input, I can figure out what those things are. And if I see a scoring from a report perspective that supports that, I can go ahead and say those are the ones I want to look at from an approval perspective. So you can use Power BI to manage the overall portfolio as it progresses. And some of the other reports that we have from we can look at them from a financials perspective if you want to understand it. And this gets back to the business case side of it, validating our ROI. So we got portfolio projects, controls versus actuals. So we can actually do the real-time budget analysis in terms of where we are from a costing perspective. So, Power BI is just tremendously powerful from a, the ability to bring lots of data from a lot of different sources and provide these great insight, these great views that are very impactful, and allow the project managers and portfolio managers to be on board. Okay, Lori, any questions so far? I know we've got a couple minutes left here.
No questions.
Okay. All right. So, yes. So, so in terms of the demo we did today, this is the end of the session, and I think hopefully everybody can see how the portfolio and the intake process would work. Next month we're going to talk about new product development and innovation. That's going to be fine. That's going to be about fine-tuning that input process here, and how do we develop an incubation engine and an innovation engine that goes forward for developing new projects. And then after that we'll talk about resource management. We talked, because you saw the handoff between portfolio and resourcing. So if I've got projects I can't do because I'm short resources, what do we do from a resource management process? So that's going to be that one. And then the whole reporting and dashboards, which surrounds the ecosystem, is going to come next.
John, you have one question.
Yep.
Do all users have to have Power BI to view the reports you shared?
If you want to go into Power BI, you need to have a license to do so. But what you can do, and a lot of companies do this already. Let me bring the thing up here. If you want to drop these things into PowerPoint, you can export the reports to PowerPoint, and those can be published. The challenge that I see pretty much uniformly is project managers spending a tremendous amount of time developing reports. So you can have the people in the PMO, for example, running these and monitoring these reports and doing the approvals. But if you want to just have something that's useful for a broader distribution, you can export to PowerPoint and you can send the reports out.
Okay, the question was, are they exportable? So you answered that, right?
Yep. Export to PowerPoint, export to SharePoint, push them out to the web. And if anybody wants to play with Power BI, the desktop version, it's a free version. So you can just go on the Microsoft website, download it, and play with it. And you can get things like these content packs. Like the thing that's kind of neat here is if you go to Get Data and you go to Services, for example, there is a series of content packs that are associated with other applications that are out there. So, for example, ServiceNow, they have one for incidents, for example. So if you want to have a standard content pack and look at ServiceNow, they have one that's already prepared. It's free for anybody who's using it. Some of the other ones we see all the time is I use them for ClickDimensions is one if you're doing work with ClickDimensions. There's one here for Jira. I know they do one as well if you're doing anything around agile development. Market, there's some Dynamics, you can do some of those. So there's a whole series of different ones that are out in the marketplace that are free. Any other questions for anybody? There's a lot of material to do in an hour. I'm sorry if I had to move along pretty quickly.
Nothing else.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Please, I hope to see you next month. We're going to continue the story here, and hopefully everybody can see why this is why it all hangs together. If anybody has any questions, you can reach out to me or Lori, but this is my email address. And if you're in Los Angeles, Denver, or Dallas, please love to have you at one of our workshops. We're just going to walk through the stuff online, so you can get to play with the tool. We'll talk about some of the concepts that we've got here, but we can, how to actually, play with the tool and get it to do what it needs to do. Appreciate your attendance, and hopefully I'll talk to you next month. Thank you. Bye-bye.